Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Welcome to Pittsburgh, Virginia. And yeah, we're going to talk about war. We're going to talk about men from this area who fought in the Revolution as Virginia soldiers. Something that I'll tell you, the Uber driver who took me here this morning had no idea. He said, so where are you headed? What are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to go give a speech. He goes, about what? And I said, the Revolutionary War. And he said, cool. And I said, did you know it was illegal to live here until 1768? No way, right? So I invited him to come. Are you here, Uber driver? No, he's not here. That is a wine bottle that was given by President George Washington to a guy named Abraham Kirkpatrick after the Whiskey Rebellion to say thank you. I know one guy in the room who knows who Abraham Kirkpatrick was. He's sitting over here because he wrote a book about the Whiskey Rebellion. That, believe it or not, that was put up for auction several years ago and nobody bought it. I don't know where it is now, but the result of that is there's a picture of it on the internet. And we'll get back to the Whiskey Rebellion towards the end of the presentation. But I do want to talk about Abraham Kirkpatrick. He lived here in Pittsburgh. He's buried here. And he has as good a claim to be a founding father of Pittsburgh as anybody else. In fact, he's one of those guys who lived here when it was illegal to do so. His dad was a Jacobite who fled Scotland after the Battle of Culloden, settled in Cecil County, Maryland, at the top of the Chesapeake Bay. Abraham was born 2 years later. When he was a teenager, I think 17 years old, he went to the horse races. Horse races were popular back then. At horse races in Cecil County, people would often drink copious amounts of alcohol and get rip-roaring drunk. And, you know, he's strapping 17, 18-year-old kid, and this guy comes up who's drunk and says, I want to fight. So they have a fight, and Abraham Kirkpatrick beat the daylights out of him. Well, the drunk had the temerity to say, that wasn't a fair fight. You were sober. So the next day, he insists on a rematch. So they had a rematch. Abraham Kirkpatrick beat the daylights out of him and went home, and then found out the next day that the drunken pugilist was in fact dead. Kirkpatrick had killed him. That didn't bode well for Kirkpatrick's immediate future in the community. So he got out of, I was going to say got out of Dodge, but he actually went to Dodge, Pittsburgh. I think of Pittsburgh as Dodge City at this point in its history. People came here because they weren't welcome somewhere else, right? Because they were escaping debt, because they'd killed a guy and had to get out of their home communities. If you read Reverend McClure's diary or a number of other accounts, the folks that lived here back then were not exactly Sunday school teachers, right? This was a rough town. And it was, in fact, illegal to live here until 1768 unless you were a member of the garrison at the fort, involved in an industry that was supporting the fort, and you were supposed to be there, or one of a number of Indian traders, diplomats, and such. For an average person from Cecil County, Maryland, or from down in Virginia, like just moving here to stake a claim, not allowed. This was on the wrong side of the King's Proclamation line, which made it a perfect place for Abraham Kirkpatrick to go hide. You're going to hear more about him, a lot more. Okay, so when the Revolutionary War started, Virginia recruited 2 regiments from districts. It's a fairly complicated system. The original 2 regiments were the 1st and 2nd Regiments, led by Patrick Henry, who was colonel of the 1st Virginia Regiment, and William Woodford, who commanded the 2nd Virginia Regiment. Patrick Henry had many virtues. Among them was not military ability. But he was the most popular man in Virginia, and he wanted to be a colonel, so he got to be a colonel. The system that they devised was they would group counties into districts, and each district was supposed to produce 1 company for the 2 regiments. And they were both undersized regiments according to British standards. The 1st Virginia Regiment had 8 companies. The 2nd Virginia Regiment had 7 companies. Western counties produced riflemen. Eastern counties were supposed to carry muskets, but maybe most of them had Fowlers or whatever they could find. So one of the frontier companies came from the West Augusta District, which is where we are. The captain of that company was George Gibson. You can see his name down here. That's a name that, if you know your local history, you should be familiar with. This is a map of the Virginia frontier. You'll note that I have Braddock's Road on there, but not the Forbes Road. The Forbes Road is what enabled Pennsylvania to steal this territory from Virginia, so I don't recognize it. It's not on the map, and it's not going on the map. Don't ask. So this is a map of Virginia with a focus on the western counties when the war broke out. You know about Lord Dunmore's War. I'm not going to rehash that. That was the last Indian War of the colonial era for Virginia. When the war ended, Virginia maintained militia garrisons at Fort Pitt, Fort Henry, Fort Randolph. At that time, known as Fort Dunmore, Fort Fincastle, and Fort Blair, until after they kicked out the Virginia governor. Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, literally his very last act before fleeing the colony was to dismiss the garrisons from these places, which left the frontier defenseless. So when the 3rd Virginia Convention started to organize militarily, among the things it did was create the 1st and 2nd Virginia regiments, which I just told you about, but also establish 5 independent frontier companies to go reman these garrisons. 2 at Fort Pitt, 1 at Fort Henry, and 1 at Fort Randolph, which is Point Pleasant. The 2 companies that were posted here, the first one was led by Captain John Neville. His men came from Frederick County, Virginia, Winchester, Virginia. And they came up here to garrison the fort and protect locals, and just as important, assert Virginia's authority up here. The 2nd company was led by a guy named John Stevenson, who was originally from what is now Berkeley County, West Virginia, in the West Virginia Panhandle. We know a little bit more about his subaltern officers. Robert Bell was his first lieutenant. There's some evidence that the evil Simon Girty, the famous turncoat of the Revolution, was 2nd lieutenant. Edward Rice was 3rd lieutenant. And Simon Morgan was the ensign. Both of these companies had 100 men, so that's a large company, hence the 3 lieutenants. And it was also stationed up here. The war proceeds. It's pretty clear that this isn't a fake war, this is a real war, and we need real soldiers and more men. So the 4th Virginia Convention authorized 7 more Virginia regiments, one of which was to be a German regiment. This is the famous Peter Muhlenberg Regiment. You can see there which counties it was supposed to come from. Augusta, West Augusta, Berkeley, Culpeper, Dunmore, Fincastle, Frederick, and Hampshire counties. This is a map of where they're coming from. This is Augusta County. Brady and I were just talking about this. It is one big county. The Crown had started to veto legislation authorizing the creation of new counties, because every time you did that, 2 additional people were elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. And if you are going to elect new Burgesses from out here, they are going to be frontier Scotch-Irish people who like to fight and are not happy with the Crown. And the Crown doesn't want more people like that in the House of Burgesses, so no more counties, right? So this line here is imaginary. Revolutionary Virginia sort of created a de facto 2nd county up here, but it's really still technically part of Augusta County. So that's drilling down pretty deep. This part of Virginia is heavily German. Peter Muhlenberg, the colonel, is from right here. Abraham Bowman, the lieutenant colonel, is from right here. And Peter Helfenstein, the major, is from here. All 3 are German. They wanted orderly, rule-following Germans to run this regiment, not Scotch-Irish, who by stereotype like to break things and not follow orders. I think it's literally exactly the motivation. But you've also got this vast territory out here. I mean, Fincastle County goes to the Mississippi, right? West Augusta is huge, right? This is the true frontier, all of this. So that's the 8th Virginia Regiment, and you'll see that the first company up here is John Stevenson's. So that they are now regimenting that independent company that was created as the first company of the 8th Virginia Regiment. What makes it different from the other 9 companies is, as I just said, it's a pre-existing company, but it was also originally raised in 1775, which means its men are on 1-year enlistments. All of the other companies are recruited for 2-year enlistments. So Stevenson's company is going to disappear partway through the career of the 8th Virginia. Down here you'll see William Crawn. That is another company that is raised in West Augusta, up here at Fort Pitt, but it could be anywhere in this territory here, including Wheeling, Brownsville, or Redstone Fort, other places like that. So that's the 8th Virginia Regiment. Here's William Crawn. He came here, he was probably a British soldier who was stationed, I think up in New York or something, evidently junior officer, evidently resigned his commission, moved down here. He had a relative, evidently his uncle, who was George Crawn, who was the famous Indian trader, speculator, deputy Indian agent for the crown around here. George Crawn was one of the few people who was allowed to live here. In fact, he's specifically named in the Pennsylvania statute before the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. So William came here. There's a guy who claims that he rescued Crawn from drunkenness and beggary and gave him a job in 1771. So we know he was here at least by that time. He's the captain of that other West Augusta company in the 8th Virginia. We've talked a lot about weaponry today, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. The top 2 firearms are rifles. Rifles, I like to say, and you're going to tell me this isn't a technical enough explanation. What I like to say is that rifles throw fastballs because they got a nice spin on them, and they fly straight. Muskets throw knuckleballs. They wobble and they don't go as far. Is that fair?
I like the football analogy.
Football, okay, we'll spin. All right, football. The 8th Virginia Regiment is the only regiment in the entire Virginia line that was 100% rifles. We hear a lot about Morgan's riflemen and other rifle units. The 8th Virginia is the original one. It's clear to me that the Americans, Virginians in particular, learned how to use these hunting weapons more effectively as military tools through the war. And it's also clear, because he said so, that Peter Muhlenberg was frustrated with rifles. He evidently did not quite figure out how to use them effectively. The bottom one is a French musket, for comparison. This is what the 8th Virginia soldiers dressed like. They dyed their hunting shirts with walnut, and that was the official Virginia uniform. It says so repeatedly in the records of the Virginia Convention. Hunting shirts early on with breeches, almost always buckskin or deerskin breeches, hats like that. They didn't get the familiar blue coats until later, and not consistently until about 1779. There's Peter Muhlenberg, the colonel. He is from Pennsylvania. He's from eastern Pennsylvania. He was a Lutheran-trained cleric who took a Church of England, Anglican, we would now say Episcopal ordination, so that he could preach in Virginia. And that somehow turned him into a Continental Army general. I've got a video on my website if you want to learn all about it. Okay, now back up here. John Stevenson's company, there is no surviving muster roll. We know some names from pension applications. We know the company officers from official lists. Anybody who has an asterisk next to the name, I have assessed that they were probably in the company. There should be 68 privates, 4 sergeants, and 4 company officers here. So at least 53 names are missing. But that's John Stevenson's company on 1-year enlistments, raised up here. John Stevenson lived down on Jacobs Creek in what I think is Fayette County now. So they marched 450 miles to get down to the Virginia Tidewater. The rendezvous point for the 8th Virginia Regiment was here at Suffolk, Virginia, which is close to Norfolk. You're more familiar with Norfolk than Suffolk. First, they went to Williamsburg up here, and this is where the officers picked up their commissions. They then marched down here to Jamestown, took the ferry across to Cobham, through Smithfield, down to Suffolk. Suffolk was an important place. It is a choke point between the Great Dismal Swamp down here and the Nansemond River estuary. This part of Virginia was really a Tory stronghold. That's why we have the Battle of Great Bridge. That's why Norfolk was burned on New Year's Day, 1776. And Lord Dunmore's out here in the river on boats, raiding, etc. And this is his base of support. The rest of Virginia is very patriotic, Whig. So Suffolk is sort of the spot in between. So this is where they go first and serve. Major General Charles Lee then shows up. He is in charge of the Southern Department of the Continental Army. So that is Virginia and South. And he finds out that there's a British fleet headed to Charleston, and he says, okay, we got to go. And he grabs the 8th Virginia Regiment because they're the best equipped and best armed and most complete regiment in the Virginia line. And says, we're going to Charleston. One problem, they're not Continental Army soldiers yet. They are provincial soldiers. It is literally not their job to protect anybody other than Virginia. So when he takes them across the state line, some guys say, yeah, I'm out of here, and they desert. And there's lots of grumbling. But Stevenson's men, who've already marched 450 miles to get to Suffolk, now have the pleasure of marching another 450 miles to get to Charleston. And they are without tents, with limited rations. They're very unhappy. And they're at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. This is one of the Southern events that in 1840, everybody would have known what it is. Nowadays, it doesn't get the attention that it should. But it was a major, major early Patriot victory. The short version of it is that there's a fort down here facing off against the British fleet. The fort is made out of palmetto wood, which is soft. So shooting cannonballs at it was kind of like hurling marbles at a pillow. They just sort of bounced off. And the Americans won, improbably. Even Charles Lee was sure that they were going to lose. That's why he built this bridge of boats so that they could escape. John Stevenson and others of the 8th Virginia, they were up here with their rifles, ready to cross if things went well. And they did, but they marched all the way up here where other South Carolinians were fending off an amphibious assault from another island. And they were successful as well. So that was June 28th, 1776. Huge event, greatly boosted Charles Lee's reputation. After that, the news arrived of the Declaration of Independence. They celebrated. John Stevenson's men's one-year enlistments were up, and they marched, what's the math, 900 miles to go home. Many of them had malaria at this point. So that is the end of the line for John Stevenson's company. Not the end of the line for John Stevenson or his men, though. William Crawn, meanwhile, was the last company of the 8th Virginia to fill its ranks. And it marched to the Suffolk Rendezvous and got there a month after the 8th Virginia had already left. This is a complete list of the men in William Crawn's company. In fact, it's too complete. There are more than 68 soldiers there. The reason for that is that when they got down there, the regiment was gone, but there were other stragglers who'd shown up late. Recruiting officers were still sending men forward. Men who were too sick to march south with Charles Lee were now feeling better. And all of these men were stuck under Crawn. So he ended up with a company that was twice the size of a normal one. And they began to refer to it as a detachment instead of a company because it was clearly more than a company. But that's a complete list of men and then some. A couple notable things. There's Abraham Kirkpatrick, the guy that murdered somebody at the horse race. Lieutenant James Higgins, he was up here with George Rogers Clark shortly after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, exploring and setting up a camp. They've got a kid here, Adam Dietz. He's just a child volunteer. He's a hanger-on. This happened. I've got another company that has the same thing. So Crawn's company is now attached to the 1st Virginia Regiment. It has to go somewhere, and the 8th Virginia is gone. So they attach it to the 1st Virginia. George Gibson, who I mentioned, if you can see him down here, the other West Augusta company that was originally raised for the 1st, they're now off on a secret mission. They are sent down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans to get gunpowder. So George Gibson's now gone. That mission was successful. But the 1st Virginia is under strength. William Cron's got 120 guys sitting around, and so General Andrew Lewis says, well, we're just going to stick you in with the 1st, and that made the 1st Virginia complete to a man, which you never see. There's always somebody missing. But at least on the day that it was done, the 1st Virginia was complete to a man. And then it and the 3rd Virginia were sent north to support George Washington in the summer of '76. They were, after being shuffled around a little bit, assigned to General William Alexander's brigade. William Alexander claims to be a Scottish earl, and nobody really questioned it, so he's known as Lord Stirling, usually. Patrick Henry is long gone. Isaac Reed is now the colonel, and then they're paired with George Whedon's 3rd Virginia, the Delaware Regiment, the Pennsylvania State Rifle Regiment. So they are not Continental soldiers, they are provincial soldiers. The 1st and the 3rd are now finally in the Continental Line, and 2 battalions of flying camp. So they're militia on special service, not as well trained as others, from Berks County and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That's the brigade that they serve in through '76. They get there just as the British are taking all of Manhattan. On the way to White Plains, who watched Turn, that terrible, completely inaccurate television miniseries? You remember Robert Rogers, the guy in the bonnet? So he is just raising the Queen's Rangers at this point. And Abraham Kirkpatrick and the other riflemen, Captain Cron's men, they launch a late night attack at Mamaroneck at Heathcote Hill and capture a bunch of Robert Rogers' men. That's their first action. Then they go up to the Battle of White Plains, and I'm going to explain a little bit here. I'm not going to give the details about the battle. Usually what happens over here on Chatterton's Hill is what gets all the attention. Riflemen, and remember, they've got the Pennsylvania State Rifles in the same brigade with all of these Virginia riflemen. They're doing what riflemen are supposed to do. They're skirmishing. So the British are marching north from here, and they are doing what they call bringing on the attack. They're harassing, they're slowing the march. Armies march in columns. If you start shooting at them, they have to form into a line instead of a column, otherwise they're just dominoes that you can knock down, right? So the Virginia Continental Rifles, and that's William Cron's men, and the Pennsylvania State Rifles, they're doing exactly that, particularly with Clinton's men as they march up. So that's important service, right? I mean, they're in a sustained, probably 2 or 3 hour engagement there, even if the main battle then happens over here. So that's the Battle of White Plains. Let me tell you a little bit about the status of Captain Cron's detachment. Cron himself is sick, so he's gone for almost all of this. He's probably in Philadelphia trying to get better. So Abraham Kirkpatrick is really in charge of the detachment. Sergeant Thomas McCarty, who is one of Cron's men from here, he keeps a diary off and on. He also, before they marched north, he recorded all of the messes in the detachment. I've never seen a list of messes from Continental Army anywhere else. There may be one, but I have not seen one anywhere. And here's a couple pages from it. You see there's 6 men in a mess, and some of them have women. There are a couple of people who are not on the rolls, who I think are just camp followers. So it's an amazing document. In the same notebook, he keeps a diary off and on. Some of it's really tough to read, right? So December 20th, it was snowing. It was the first snow of the season and extremely cold. I had no house to sleep in. I didn't even have a blanket. You know the bloody footprints in the snow you hear about? That's not hyperbole. These guys were really barefoot, wearing rags, cutting their feet as they marched. There are other entries where he says that his fingernail slid off his finger. He clearly had frostbite. The grass hut that he built for himself on the west side of the banks of the Delaware right before Trenton, it caught fire and he lost everything he owned, including his breeches. So the service was extremely difficult, extremely. Abraham Kirkpatrick, meanwhile, there's, I think, a sentence in David Hackett Fisher's book on Washington's Crossing about this. But there were harassing operations on the east side of the Delaware for at least 3 weeks before the Battle of Trenton. I think it's often credited to the New Jersey militia, and I'm sure that they were active and involved. But here are 3 statements that Abraham Kirkpatrick was leading Continental Riflemen on the other side of the river. in advance of Trenton. So that is real important service that ought to be remembered. Then, of course, they crossed the Delaware, the Battle of Trenton, and this is from Thomas McCarty's diary. 26th of December, 1776. Came there about daybreak and beat the damn Hessians and took 700 and odd prisoner. And the worst day of sleet and snow that could be. The last line's cut off there. So he wrote that presumably that day in that book. It's a neat thing to see. As I understand it, the retreat from Trenton was even harder than the approach to Trenton. There was ice on the banks of the river. You couldn't quite walk on it because it would break, but the boats couldn't quite get to the shore either. So a lot of guys fell in the water. They got hypothermia. People were terribly ill. The Army was in far worse shape than they were when they approached Trenton. Lord Stirling is one who's now out of commission for that reason. The other thing I want to point out is that every history you read about the 10 crucial days, about Trenton, Assunpink Creek, and Princeton, says that the enlistments were going to expire at December 31st. And Washington was desperate, and they bribed guys to stay for 10 extra days. It's just not true. It's only true for the northern troops. All of the Virginians were on at least 2-year enlistments. And that's 5 regiments, right? The 1st Virginia had been re-enlisted on 3-year terms before they marched north, right before Cron's men were attached to it. So all of the Virginians were there for at least another year and a half. Flying camp guys left on December 1st, but it is not true that the Army was about to disappear. So they crossed again, Battle of Assunpink Creek. I'm not going to tell you about that. This is what the day looked like the morning of the Battle of Princeton. One of the accounts says that there was a beautiful hoarfrost all over everything. Hoarfrost is a spiky, feathery frost that grows when the temperature drops quickly and it's been humid. They're like little swords on everything. Stirling's gone. The brigade is shrunk. Andrew Lewis's full-to-a-man regiment, which would have meant over 700 people, including officers, there are 21, according to Stryker, 21 soldiers from the 1st Virginia Regiment, including the 8th Virginia guys, left. Everybody else is out of commission. That's how bad it was. So they are folded into Hugh Mercer's brigade, along with a few Delaware soldiers. They're all gone. A few brave ones decided to stick around. The Pennsylvania State Riflemen and miscellaneous others. So here's Mercer's brigade. Here's the Pennsylvania Associators. Right, so the Pennsylvania State Rifles are under Mercer with the 1st Virginia, and Cron's men under Kirkpatrick. These are associators. That's basically Pennsylvania militia, right? George Washington's up here. Princeton's up here. So they're taking a side road to go up to Princeton. Meanwhile, British soldiers are going this way. They're heading back to Trenton because they think that's where the action is. And they see each other. So Hugh Mercer is told to charge up here and block these soldiers so that they can't turn around and go back and alert the garrison in Princeton. So they charge up the hill. They go through a fence, another fence. There's an orchard here. There's a barn. There's a farmhouse. They run through, and here's a bunch of redcoats lined up. So they back up, straighten out, and this is just Mercer's men, right? And they engage in a quick firefight. What kind of weapon are the Virginians holding? Rifles. How long does it take to load a rifle? A lot longer than a musket. So they fire one round, and then they're in big trouble because they don't even have bayonets. They're holding clubs at this point, right? And the British charge at them, and they turn around and run. Hugh Mercer's killed, Hazlitt's killed, Abraham Kirkpatrick is shot, a whole bunch of other people are dead. Cadwallader's associators finally show up. They're coming up here, and they crash into each other in this absolute chaos. Washington rides in front of the line and sort of calms everybody down and says, form back up. Meanwhile, all of the other Americans are closing in, and they end up with, I guess, what's really a double envelopment, and it turns into a really important American victory. Probably more important than Trenton. This is an old illustration of what happened to Hugh Mercer. I think his horse was shot out from under him, and then they bayoneted him and clubbed him repeatedly. My absolute favorite Revolutionary War memorial is in Princeton, New Jersey. That is Hugh Mercer being held up by a Pennsylvania rifleman. I look at that and it makes me want to cry. It's just, and he had just like a week before said that he would be willing to give his life for his country, and he very promptly did. Okay, so fast forwarding. Late in '76, Virginia is told that it needs to raise more regiments, so it authorizes 7 more, one of which is the 13th Virginia Regiment. You remember John Stevenson's guys are done. Their 1-year enlistments were up. So Stevenson has malaria probably, so he's not serving, but his lieutenant, Robert Bell, forms the first company for the 13th Virginia Regiment, which is raised entirely in what had been the West Augusta District. It has now been organized into 3 counties. These guys were promised that they were going to be Continentals, but they were going to get to stay here to protect the frontier. That promise wasn't kept. And John Gibson here, by the way, the lieutenant colonel, he is the brother of George Gibson, who I mentioned earlier from the 1st Virginia. Okay, so everybody goes east for the '77 campaign. The 8th Virginia is now under command of Abraham Bowman because Muhlenberg's a general. They're in Charles Scott's brigade. The 13th Virginia, which I just introduced to you, under Colonel William Russell, they're under Peter Muhlenberg's brigade. This is the last strength report from William Cron's company before his detachment fell apart and men went back to the companies they really belonged to. And it's going to be hard for you guys to see, but this is after that really hard '76 campaign. And he says, the fifer's dead, the drummer's dead. He's got 106 men total. 22 of them are fit for duty and present. 4 of them are sick and present. 14 are sick in Philadelphia. 4 are sick in Bristol. Sick. 27 are dead, 6 deserted, 3 on furlough, et cetera, et cetera. So he's got 22 men fit for duty after that just remarkable nation-creating '76 campaign. I am not going to tell you the story of the Philadelphia campaign. We don't have time, but this is their service in 1777 through 1778. Lots of important stuff. And I don't have time to tell you about it, sorry. I will say though that this illustration was drawn by a British soldier in 1777. It says a rifleman, and then he wrote a little caret. It says a Virginia rifleman. So this is what the guys I'm talking about looked like as late as the fall of '77. You will note he's not wearing breeches anymore. He's wearing what they called overalls. So they're basically pants with gaiters at the bottom. Okay, now I'm just going to tell you a few stories in the time that I've got left, which isn't much. You saw at the end of that last list that on September 14th, '78, the Virginia line was consolidated. They had too many officers, not enough men, so they squished everybody together. And then not much happens through '79. This is an illustration of Paulus Hook. You've heard of the Battle of Paulus Hook. In this battle, an 8th Virginia captain named Jonathan Clark, who was the brother of George Rogers Clark and the big brother of William Clark, as in Lewis and Clark. He leads his men across the moat here, breaks down the fence, and they run in here. Others do it on this side, and there's a feint here. They just charge in, grab a bunch of prisoners, and leave. That's New York City over here, by the way. They don't burn anything, they don't spike the cannons, they don't steal any supplies, nothing. So they are kind of criticized for how they did this. The operation was organized by Light Horse Harry Lee. And Congress thinks it's just fantastic, and they strike a medal for him. Problem is, Jonathan Clark, my 8th Virginia guy who came across here, he outranked Lee. He was the senior officer on site. So this creates a little bit of a controversy, and William Cron from Pittsburgh, who's now feeling better and back at service, he raises a huge stink. And he says, he writes to a friend, several officers have been much injured in the Virginia line on account of giving Major Henry Lee the command of 300 of our men to reduce Paulus Hook, and unjust methods taken by him to have the command by telling one of our majors, this is Jonathan Clark, who marched with 300 men, that his commission was older than it really is. I think Light Horse Harry Lee is going to be arrested. He was arrested, and there was a trial. And Jonathan Clark was very gracious and said, hey, this raid was Light Horse Harry's idea. I don't mind him being in command for the day. Everything's good. And Clark was credited for being a gentleman. But William Crawn, who was his best friend and ended up marrying Clark's sister, was really upset. Okay, Abraham Kirkpatrick, the senior-most lieutenant, has just been promoted to captain. Kirkpatrick is the most senior captain. I don't know what's going on, but I think he thinks that Leonard Cooper, the younger guy, is putting on airs. And he walks out on the parade with a stick and does what he did at that horse race. He beat the daylights out of Leonard Cooper. Now, one thing you need to understand is that back in those days, beating somebody with a stick meant something. If you were going to fight with a fellow gentleman, you challenged him to a duel. If you were going to beat somebody who was your lesser or fight with them, you whipped them or you beat them with a stick. This is how slaves were punished, right? So for him to go out and beat another officer with a stick was a clear challenge to his manhood, his dignity, and his status as a gentleman. Leonard Cooper was a peaceable type, evidently, and he didn't want to do anything about it. All the officers said, if you will not defend your honor, we will not serve with you. So Cooper very hesitantly challenged Kirkpatrick to a duel and lost. He got shot in the leg high up, got his leg amputated. He was transferred to the Corps of Invalids, was one of the very last soldiers dismissed from the Continental Army, I think in 1784. He was a cripple for life, and he died drowning in the Shenandoah River after falling off his horse. Thank you, Abraham Kirkpatrick. He's a bully. William Crawn and the rest of the Virginia line, they were sent down to Charleston to rescue it. In 1780, they were in the siege of Charleston. They were captured. They surrendered on May 12th under Benjamin Lincoln. So Jonathan Clark, who I mentioned, William Crawn, who I've been talking about quite a bit, and almost all of the Virginia line are taken prisoner. One guy who was not there was Abraham Kirkpatrick. I think because he was temporarily in command of a hospital operation in New York. This is an excerpt from a diary kept by William Crawn briefly, where he describes a cannonball going through his tent, breaking his table, burrowing itself 2 feet into the ground. An artillery officer coming by and saying, "Are you okay? Hey, what's that in the ground? Can I dig it up?" And he reloaded it, put it in his cannon, and fired it back at the at the British. Okay, his pants are great. You can look at them all you want, but what I want you to look at are the tents. This is, I think, the only contemporary illustration of a Continental Army encampment. I've got another Abraham Kirkpatrick story to tell you. So in 1781, he is in Gaskin's battalion. We were just talking about Gaskins. A newly enlisted guy named James Grant has brought his wife with him to camp. And he starts to notice that his wife and Abraham Kirkpatrick are spending an awful lot of time together, which ain't great. So one night he's told to go stand guard, and he doesn't want to go because he thinks that Kirkpatrick's going to take advantage of his wife while he's standing guard. So he hires another guy to do it instead. And the Kirkpatrick says, "No, you can't do that. Now you both have to stand guard." So James Grant is steaming and standing guard, and the minute he's done, he goes back to his tent to check on his wife, and she's not there. So he goes to Kirkpatrick's tent, looks in, doesn't see anything, doesn't hear anything, so he steps back into the shadows and just stands there. And about a minute later, he hears giggling. There's a loaded musket right there. He picks it up and fires it into Kirkpatrick's tent. Shoots out Kirkpatrick's eye and takes out a chunk of his skull. Kirkpatrick comes out of the tent and says, hey, something like, I already broke up with your wife. Why'd you shoot me? It's a little inscrutable what the record says. But so Grant is arrested. There is a court martial. He is unanimously condemned, not for attempted murder, but for inciting a mutiny, and he is hanged. Anthony Wayne is in command, but he knows that there are political sensitivities about a Pennsylvania officer sentencing a Virginian to death. So he sends the document to Lafayette to sign, and Lafayette orders the man hanged. Up in the West, up here, there's a whole Northwestern campaign trying to counter the British out of Fort Detroit. I just wanted to show you this because 4 of the men in command of Fort McIntosh, which is now Beaver, there's John Gibson, who we mentioned. Richard Campbell's an 8th Virginia guy. There's Daniel Broadhead, who we mentioned earlier. Robert Bell is that captain from John Stevenson's company. Simon Morgan, same thing. So very active up there. John Stevenson at this time, he's no longer a continental officer. He's in the militia. Well, which militia, right? Because nobody knows which state we're in here, right? Well, he's definitely Virginia militia, and they are desperate for militiamen. So he starts doing this thing where he sends his officers around literally to kidnap Pennsylvania-oriented men and charge them with desertion for not doing duty in the militia. Well, these are men who are perfect. They're signed up for the Pennsylvania militia. But he says they're supposed to be in the Virginia militia. So he arrests them, fines them, and then says you can pay off your fine by serving 2 months in the militia, and carts them up to Fort McIntosh. When Patrick Henry, who's now the governor, finds out, he is mortified and puts an end to it. But the tensions between Pennsylvania and Virginia were very much alive, even as late as 79, 80. After the war, Virginia soldiers were granted land in the West. This is one of the inducements that they got to enlist if they stayed in service long enough. William Cron was very involved in this. So you had the Continental Line and you had the State Line. There were different reserves for the men in the West, and Cron made himself indispensable through the whole process. George Rogers Clark was in charge of distributing the land for the State Line, but he was soon pulled to do Indian diplomacy. So William Cron took over for that. And he was basically being in charge of handing out the land is a pretty good gig. And he became very wealthy. I've got a whole article about this online. Here is Abraham Kirkpatrick. He's one of the surveyors early in the process. And he, after there was this land lottery, you had to be in Louisville, Kentucky to participate. You got the best land if you went out there. There was a backup reserve in Ohio that was still off limits. But on his way home here to Pittsburgh, Kirkpatrick is sent to sort of reconnoiter up in Ohio in that territory. And he sees a few of them damned Cherokees up there, right? This guy does not like Indians, although he does say that the other native tribes that are in the area seem to want peace. So that's a note to Richard Clough Anderson, who was in charge of Continental Line land distribution. Lots and lots and lots of people moved to Kentucky, and this is how they went. They floated down the river in flatboats. Among them was John Stevenson. This is his house in Cynthiana, Kentucky. It still survives. It fell into disrepair and was used as a barn for a while, but it has been restored. His grave was discovered in 1956 by these 3 boys on the left. In the early 80s, you can see it on the right, it clearly has been messed with because it's leaning against a tree and it's no longer stuck in the ground. It was then stolen. It was then anonymously returned, and that's what it looks like. That is not engraved, it is scratched. Right? Many gravestones for people back then were scratched like that because it was cheaper. It has been replaced because it's a little bit fragile. That's what it looks like. That is William Cron on the right with his wife. They lived a long time. There they are as old people in Louisville, Kentucky. That's their mansion house, which is now a major, like every school kid in Louisville goes there on a school trip at some point. Here in Pittsburgh, Kirkpatrick Street. That's the memorial he gets. That's his grave in Allegheny Cemetery. That's what it says. I won't give you much time to read that. He was originally buried at the First Presbyterian Church downtown. Through most of his life here, it looked like the image on the left. The nice church on the right was, I guess, 12 years old when he died, and that's where he was buried. That's what the church looks like now. There is no cemetery. All those graves were moved, and that's what it looks like now. It's not in great shape. The tree next to it is chopping it to bits on the right. The rest of it's fallen to pieces. This is John Gibson's grave, same deal. Moved from the same church to the same cemetery, and it is cracked into pieces. They're not in good shape. This is what they looked like originally. That is a table marker. When they were moved, evidently, the platform was dispensed with. They were buried under the ground, and the table was just placed right on the ground, which explains why they look as they do today. This is from Wacomico Church, Virginia. This is the church where George Washington was probably baptized. Those are replacements for old table markers that were similarly in disrepair, and the church created new. These are granite, they'll last forever. The inscriptions are faithfully recreated, and I put that there as a very strong hint for people who live in this community. That John Gibson and Abraham Kirkpatrick, maybe they deserve to have their graves spruced up. That's my website for my 8th Virginia research. I don't add much to it anymore because my book is out. I'm now running this website, which expands the aperture to Virginia generally. I have a Facebook feed and a YouTube channel, and that is my book. Everything I told you today is in there, plus much, much more. Thank you all. Do we have time for questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Anybody got one? Yes, sir. Are you related to Abraham Kirkpatrick?
I am, yeah.
I thought you might be. I have looked and not seen any. I don't think there's a list. But I would say it's very likely. And I'm sorry that I made your ancestor look so bad. I'm really sorry. So that was a light infantry operation, and he was the quintessential light infantryman. So I'd be very surprised if he was not. And he was definitely in the area, but I don't have proof. And again, I'm really sorry. The stories are just too good not to tell. Yes, sir. One and the same. Yep, and that is why George Washington sent that wine to him. I meant to close with that. I assume it was a case of wine, but that one bottle was preserved. Okay, thank you all very much. This was a great pleasure.